She walked into that room and every conversation stopped. Not because she was radiant, not because she commanded attention, but because she didn't belong, and every single person in that candlelit room knew it the moment she crossed the threshold. A size 22 woman in a dark green dress, standing in a doorway full of crystal chandeliers, silver flatware, and people who looked like they'd been sculpted rather than born. They looked at her arms, they looked at her hips, they looked at each other. A platinum-haired woman at the end of the table pressed her lips together so hard her jaw trembled, fighting the laughter she hadn't yet decided to release. Nobody said a word. They didn't have to. The silence said everything. She had been sent there as a joke, and she could feel every stare, every whispered smirk held behind perfect teeth, every pair of polished eyes measuring her body and finding it wrong. She wanted to turn around. She wanted to disappear into the marble foyer and never look back. But then the man at the head of the table stood up, and what he did next, nobody in that room was prepared for. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. Stories like this one don't come around twice. This is Soleil's story.
Some wounds don't announce themselves. They settle quietly into the body and become architecture. The way you hold your shoulders, the way you pause before entering a room, the way your knuckles go white when you grip something too tightly. Soleil Beaumont was 9 years old the first time she understood what it meant to be unwanted in a space that had technically invited her. She stood on a sidewalk in a lavender dress, hands clasped at her waist, staring up at the bay window of a birthday party she had been invited to only because her mother had called the other mother directly and asked. Through the glass, she could see the other girls laughing. One of them held up a balloon animal twisted into the shape of a pig and pointed toward the front door. The birthday girl doubled over, hand covering her mouth. The laughter was silent from where Soleil stood, but she could read it in every shaking shoulder. She turned around, walked 3 blocks home, never rang the doorbell. When her mother asked how the party was, Soleil said it was fun. She smiled when she said it, because she had already begun to understand that some pain is better swallowed whole than explained out loud. Now, 23 years later, Soleil stood outside a limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side with black iron railings and a front door so polished it reflected the street and her own face looking back at her. Her knuckles were white again. The lavender dress memory was pressing against her ribs like a fist she couldn't uncurl. She told herself this was different. She told herself she was a grown woman. She had a job to do, a reason to be here, a purpose that didn't require anyone's permission. But the feeling was identical to that sidewalk, the bone-deep certainty that she was about to walk into a room that had not saved a seat for her. She had no idea how right she was, or how completely wrong she would turn out to be. 3 days earlier, Soleil had been elbow-deep in sourdough starter at Harmon's Bakery on Arthur Avenue when her phone buzzed on the flour-dusted counter. Her cousin Nadine's name glowed on the cracked screen. Soleil almost didn't answer. Conversations with Nadine had a way of leaving her smaller, and she could never quite explain why, because Nadine never said anything that could be directly classified as cruel. She wrapped her cruelty the way a wasp builds its nest inside something beautiful, inside helpfulness, inside opportunity, inside the warm voice of someone doing you a favor. "I have a job for you," Nadine said, skipping any greeting. "One night, private dinner, you'd be helping with service, assisting the hostess, that sort of thing. Last-minute opening, and the pay is $1,500. Soleil pressed the phone harder against her ear. $1,500 was more than she made in 2 weeks at the bakery. Her mother's physical therapy bills had been stacking up like bricks against the front door. Her younger brother, Camden, needed new braces. The Honda's transmission had been slipping for months. "Why me?" she asked, because she had learned to ask that question even when she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Because you're reliable," Nadine said smoothly, "and you're available." What Soleil didn't know was that the call had happened on speaker, and by the time she said yes, the laughter had already started on the other end of the line.
Nadine's office at Lux Staffing was a glass-walled room on the 14th floor that smelled like competing perfumes and quiet ambition. When Soleil said yes and Nadine pressed mute, the office erupted. "You didn't," said Jolene, the receptionist, her hand flat against her chest like she was steadying her own heartbeat. "I absolutely did." Nadine set the phone on the desk and crossed her legs with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just solved a complicated equation. "They asked for our most stunning girl for the Callaway dinner. We're completely booked, so I'm sending Soleil." "The Callaway dinner?" Priya, the booking coordinator, leaned forward with wide eyes. "As in Silas Callaway? As in the man whose last companion was a literal runway model?" "That's the one." "They're going to lose it. They'll never hire us again." "They won't trace it back to us." Nadine inspected her nails. "I told her it was a serving gig. She shows up, realizes it's a companion placement, doesn't know what to do. The whole thing falls apart. Monday morning, I call the Callaway people, apologize profusely for the mix-up, offer them a replacement at no charge. They'll love us more for fixing it." "And Soleil?" asked Jolene. Nadine shrugged one elegant shoulder. "She gets paid, she gets a free dinner, she'll be fine. It's not like anything was going to happen anyway." A pause. "You've seen her." The laughter that followed was thin and sharp, the kind that draws blood without leaving a visible mark. Back in the Bronx, Soleil had no idea she had just been cast as the punchline of a joke being told in a glass office 14 floors above Manhattan. She was already thinking about the logistics. One nice dress, the dark green wrap her mother had given her for Christmas, the fabric soft as a whispered apology. Simple heels, her good earrings. Saturday afternoon, she got ready in her mother's bathroom because the mirror was bigger. Iris Beaumont sat in her wheelchair in the hallway, watching her daughter through the open door with the quiet intensity of a woman who had spent her whole life reading the weather in her children's faces. 20 years in that chair since the accident, and Iris still had the bearing of someone who had never once considered making herself smaller. "You look beautiful, baby," Iris said. Soleil smoothed the green dress over her hips and tried to see what her mother saw. The mirror offered her a 32-year-old woman with deep auburn locks she'd pinned carefully back, brown eyes she'd lined with a steady hand, full lips she had colored a dark berry. Her skin was clear. Her posture was something she had to consciously maintain. But the mirror also showed the rest of it, the width of her arms, the roundness of her belly, the way the dress pulled slightly at the zipper. She catalogued these things the way a prisoner catalogues the walls of their cell, with exhaustive, defeated familiarity. "Stand up straight," Iris said. "You carry yourself like you're apologizing for taking up space. Stop that." Soleil met her mother's eyes in the mirror. "I'll be home by midnight. You come home whenever you come home, and you hold your head up." The car service Nadine arranged dropped her at 7:15, and now here she was, knuckles white, memory of lavender pressing at her ribs, about to find out exactly what kind of room she'd been sent into. The door opened before she could knock. A man in a dark suit stood in the frame, well over 6 feet, built like he had been hired specifically to be a barrier between the world and whatever existed beyond that threshold. He checked a tablet when she gave her name, and something passed across his face. Not surprise, more like the flicker of a card player who had just been dealt a hand he hadn't expected. He recovered quickly. Through the foyer, second door on the left. The foyer was floored in black and white marble. A chandelier hung overhead like frozen rain. The walls held paintings that Soleil suspected cost more than her mother's house. She could smell something extraordinary. Roasted lamb with garlic and rosemary,
and beneath it, the woody residue of expensive cologne that had recently passed through the air and decided to stay. She found the second door on the left. She opened it. The dining room was long and candlelit. A table set for 12 stretched down its center, gleaming with crystal and silver. 8 people were already seated, 4 men in suits that fit like second skins, and 4 women so precisely assembled they seemed to have been manufactured rather than born. Every surface in the room caught the light and multiplied it. The wine glasses, the silverware, the women's earrings, the men's watches. And when Soleil walked in, every reflective surface seemed to turn toward her at once, capturing her from a dozen angles and holding her there, exposed and still. The silence was instantaneous, not the natural quiet of people pausing mid-conversation, the specific weighted silence that descends when something has gone wrong in a way that is also entertaining. The platinum-haired woman at the near end of the table looked Soleil up and down with the slow deliberation of someone reading a menu they've already decided to send back. The man beside her leaned in and whispered. The woman pressed her lips together, the corners of her mouth trembling with the effort of containing herself. Soleil felt the room's assessment travel across her body like hands she hadn't consented to, the width of her hips, the softness of her arms, the way her dress, which had looked beautiful in her mother's bathroom, now felt like a costume, the wrong costume. She looked for a kitchen entrance, any sign of a catering setup, an apron, a tray, a service station. There was none. Her throat went tight. Before you hear what happened next, if this story is already pulling at you, subscribe to Love in the Underworld and drop a comment below. Tell me, would you have walked out or would you have stayed? Because what Soleil does next changes everything. A man at the far end of the table stood up. He was tall and lean, early 40s, with black hair graying at the temples in a way that looked less like time's surrender and more like a deliberate choice. His suit was charcoal, cut with the precision of something built on his body rather than for it. His face was angular and composed, dark eyes that moved with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned long ago that reacting quickly was a luxury afforded to people who didn't control very much. Silas Calloway crossed the room. Every person at that table watched him the way animals watch the apex predator of their ecosystem, with a mixture of deference and fear so deeply internalized it had become reflex. He moved through their attention without acknowledging it, the way a river moves through rock without apology. He stopped in front of Soleil. She had spent her entire life preparing for the various forms rejection takes. She had a catalog organized by situation, by setting, by the particular expression people wore when they decided she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. She was prepared for dismissal, for confusion, for the polite but devastating redirect toward the kitchen. "You must be my dinner companion," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected, lower. There was no question in it, no hesitation, no performative confusion, no reaching for the script the rest of the room was clearly waiting for him to read. "I think there's been a mistake," Soleil said. "I was told this was a serving position." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, recognition, the kind that arrives when a man has seen the shape of something and already assembled the full picture before anyone else in the room has finished reading the first line. "There's no mistake," he said. "You're here, that's sufficient." He extended his hand, not to shake, to guide, palm up, fingers relaxed, the gesture of a man who opens doors rather than forces them. The room had gone so quiet that Soleil could hear a single candle flame hissing somewhere to her left. She could feel every stare on her skin like concentrated heat.
The platinum-haired woman had stopped pretending to suppress anything. She was watching this exchange with open fascination, the expression of someone witnessing a nature documentary in which the apex predator behaves entirely against its own supposed programming. Soleil looked at Silas Calloway's hand. Clean nails, a faded scar across the knuckles, no rings. She looked up at his face. His expression held nothing she could identify as pity. Pity she would have recognized instantly. She was fluent in that language, had been reading it since she was 9 years old on a sidewalk in a lavender dress. This was something else, something that felt, impossibly, like genuine interest, like a man who had just found something he hadn't expected to find and was deciding what to do about it. She placed her hand in his. He led her to the empty chair beside his own at the head of the table, pulled it out for her, and waited until she was seated before returning to his own chair. Then he turned to the man on his left. "Fletcher, you were telling me about the Newark situation." And just like that, the conversation resumed, but the air in the room had been rearranged, and everyone at that table felt it.
Dinner was served in courses. Lamb, as she had guessed, with roasted figs and a red wine reduction. A bitter green salad with shaved cheese. Bread that was almost as good as what she made at Harmon's every morning before the city woke up. Almost. Soleil ate carefully, the way she always ate in public, slowly in small portions, aware of every bite as a potential performance for others to evaluate. She had learned young that a fat woman eating in a room full of watching eyes becomes a spectacle people feel entitled to narrate. She had learned to make herself as small as possible at the table, which was a particular cruelty, because the table was one of the few places she ever felt genuinely alive. She loved food. She understood food. She spoke its language the way some people speak music, intuitively, from the body outward. "You're not eating," Silas said, without looking up from his plate. He was cutting his lamb with the focused precision of a surgeon. "I am." "You're performing eating. There's a difference." She set a fork down. "That's a strange thing to notice." "I notice most things. Professional requirement." He took a sip of wine. "You don't like the lamb?" "The lamb is excellent. The reduction is slightly over-reduced. It's leaning bitter instead of sweet. But the meat itself is perfect. The rosemary was added whole rather than chopped, which means whoever cooked this understands that rosemary releases different compounds depending on how it's cut. The fat was rendered slowly." She stopped. She had not meant to say all of that. It came out the way truth does when it's been held too long, in a rush, undressed, slightly embarrassing. But Silas Calloway had turned his full attention to her for the first time, and his expression was not condescension, not the polite tolerance of a powerful man indulging a stranger's nervous rambling. It was the specific look of a man who has just found something unexpected and is trying to decide whether it is real. "You cook," he said. "I bake. I work at a bakery in the Bronx." "Then you understand bread." Soleil glanced at the bread basket. "The bread tonight is good, mass-produced good. The crumb is even, proofed in a controlled environment, consistent air distribution, but it doesn't have character." She hesitated, then continued. "Real bread has imperfections, uneven air pockets, a crust that fights back. This bread is polite. I don't trust polite bread." The corner of Silas's mouth moved. Not a smile, something preceding a smile, the first faint light before sunrise. "I don't trust polite anything," he said. Across the table, the platinum-haired woman, whose name was Celeste and whose husband was Silas's attorney, was watching this exchange the way you watch a locked door begin to open on its own. She leaned toward her husband. He shook his head once, sharply. She leaned back. Something had shifted at that table, quietly and irrevocably, and no one yet fully understood what it meant.
It was 20 minutes into the main course. The other guests had settled into their own conversations, cautious, slightly louder than natural, the performance of people pretending they weren't listening to the one conversation that mattered. Soleil considered the question. Most people who asked about her work were really asking something else.
How did someone like you end up doing something like this, behind a counter, before dawn, smelling of yeast and sugar? But Silas's question had no subtext she could detect. It was simply a question. Because bread is honest, she said. You can't fake it. If the dough isn't right, if the timing is off, if you didn't give it enough attention, the bread tells on you. Every loaf is a record of how much care went into it. You can't buy your way out of bad bread. He was quiet for a moment. Most people in my life have spent a considerable amount of energy trying to buy their way out of things. Does it work? The question surprised them both. She saw it register on his face, a barely perceptible shift, the kind that on a less controlled man would have been a visible flinch. No one asked Silas Calloway direct questions. She understood that instinctively from the way the rest of the table operated around him. Questions redirected into statements, opinions offered only after his were established, conversations that arranged themselves like water around a stone. I've tried to buy my way out of several things, he said. I've succeeded at most of them. The ones I failed at taught me more. Like what? He looked at her with an expression she would think about for days afterward. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of something, a confession, a door he usually kept bolted from the inside, deciding whether to step forward or retreat to safer ground. Loneliness, he said. You can't buy your way out of loneliness. I've tried. Soleil didn't say anything. She had learned that silence, offered without discomfort, was sometimes the most generous thing you could give another person. She told him about Harmon's bakery then, about the owner, old Mr. Harmon, who still hand-shaped every ciabatta loaf at 4 in the morning, despite arthritic fingers and a bad hip that his doctor had been begging him to rest for 6 years. About the regulars who came in not for the bread itself, but for the feeling of being remembered, because Mr. Harmon greeted every single person by name and asked after their families with the complete sincerity of a man who believed that bread and memory were made from the same ingredients. She told him about her mother's accident, a delivery truck running a red light 7 years ago, everything different after. She told it without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and because Silas was listening in a way that made self-pity feel unnecessary. He was listening with the full weight of his attention, not the way powerful men usually listen, with one ear while the other calculates their next move. He was simply there, present, turned toward her like a compass finding north. He asked about Camden, her brother, 17, brilliant and angry in the specific way that brilliant 17-year-olds are when they can see exactly how unfair the world is, but don't yet have the tools to change it. He sounds like someone I used to know, Silas said quietly. Soleil looked at him. You? A long time ago. He didn't elaborate, but something in the way he said it made her understand that the man across from her had not always been the man at the head of the table, and that the distance between those two versions of himself had cost him considerably. By the time the dessert course arrived, a pear tart with cardamom cream that Soleil assessed silently as technically excellent but emotionally hollow, the atmosphere in the dining room had undergone a transformation that no one at the table could have predicted when the evening began. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. It was cumulative, the way weather changes before a storm, quietly and in pieces, until suddenly you notice the whole sky is different. Silas Calloway had, at various points throughout the evening, laughed once, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, when Soleil described the morning a batch of her sourdough starter had fermented so aggressively that the lid had rocketed off the container and lodged itself in the bakery ceiling. He had leaned forward when she spoke. He had refilled her water glass without being asked. He had told a story of his own, about a business negotiation in Lisbon that had gone catastrophically sideways because of a translation error involving the word for partnership and the word for surrender, and told it on himself, without vanity, with the ease of a man who no longer needed his failures to be invisible. These were small things, But small things at a table full of people who had spent years studying Silas Calloway's behavior for signals were not small things at all. Celeste, the platinum-haired woman, had stopped trying to contain her reactions entirely. She was watching openly now, her dessert fork suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth. Her husband, Marcus, Silas's attorney, had the carefully neutral expression of a man processing information he wasn't sure what to do with yet. Fletcher, the man to Silas's left, who'd spent the early part of the evening dominating conversation with port logistics, had gone almost completely quiet. His companion, a severe woman named Diane, had spent the last 40 minutes making micro-adjustments to her posture in a way that suggested she was profoundly uncomfortable with something she couldn't name. They were all watching a man they believed they understood, a man whose world operated on precise hierarchies of beauty, power, and social capital, behave as though none of those hierarchies applied to the woman beside him. And because Silas's choices were not questioned, only observed and eventually obeyed, the room had no choice but to absorb this new information and recalibrate. But they didn't understand it, and Soleil could feel their confusion like static electricity, a low charge in the air that didn't quite resolve into anything. She understood it even less than they did. She had spent the evening waiting for the moment when the real intention behind this night would reveal itself, for the punchline, for the polite dismissal, for the expression that confirmed she had been correctly read from the moment she walked in. It hadn't come. Instead, she had eaten lamb and talked about bread, and been asked questions that felt like someone had taken the time to wonder who she actually was, which was a thing so unusual she kept bracing for it to stop. Coffee was served. The other guests began to leave in slow succession, each one pausing at Silas's chair to pay their respects, a handshake, a murmured word, the particular brand of deference that sits exactly halfway between affection and carefully managed fear. Several of them glanced at Soleil as they passed, some with open curiosity, some with something harder. Celeste paused behind Soleil's chair and placed one manicured hand on the back of it, as if she'd wanted to touch Soleil herself, but couldn't quite bridge whatever distance stood between the impulse and the action. "Interesting evening," Celeste said, to no one in particular, and then she was gone. When the room was empty except for the two of them and the dying candles, Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at Soleil with the full, unfiltered attention he had been carefully rationing all evening. "You know you weren't sent here to serve dinner," he said. "I figured that out about 10 seconds after I walked in. And you stayed. I didn't know how to leave." "You knew exactly how to leave," he said. "You chose not to. Those are different things." Soleil felt the truth of this settle over her like a weighted blanket, uncomfortable because it was warm and she had been cold for so long she'd stopped noticing. He was right. She had known, and she had stayed anyway, for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself, because articulating them would have required admitting she had wanted something from this evening that she had no business wanting. "Someone sent you here as a joke," Silas said. His voice had changed. The warmth of the last 2 hours had receded, replaced by something flat and precise. The voice, she imagined, that he used in rooms where decisions were made that didn't appear in any legal record. She didn't deny it. "I suspected something was wrong from the beginning. Your cousin's agency, Lux Staffing," he said it as a statement. Soleil stared at him. "How do you—" "I told you, I notice most things." He turned his wine glass once between his fingers. The placement was a deliberate mismatch. It was designed to be embarrassing, for you and, by extension, for me. The intention was that you would arrive confused and out of place, I would be irritated, and whoever engineered it would have the satisfaction of having aimed something at both of us and watched it land. The coldness of it, stated so plainly, hit Soleil somewhere between her sternum and her throat. She had known, in the abstract, that something was wrong, but hearing it laid out with such surgical clarity made it real in a new way, made it a fact she had to hold, rather than a suspicion she could keep at a manageable distance. "I'm sorry," she said, and then hated herself for it, because she had apologized reflexively for something that had been done to her. "Don't," Silas said, quietly but firmly. "You have nothing to apologize for." He set down his glass. "The person who arranged this will be handled." "I don't want anyone handled on my behalf. That's not your decision." "It is, actually." Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "Whatever happens to Nadine or doesn't happen, that belongs to me, not to you." The silence that followed was the specific kind that precedes a recalibration. She watched him process this, watched him arrive with visible effort at a place of genuine consideration rather than override. "Fair," he said after a long moment. "I'll respect that." She believed him. She wasn't sure why. She had no particular reason to trust a man she had met 3 hours ago in circumstances arranged by someone who intended to humiliate her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been asking me things all evening. Don't stop now." "Why did you sit me next to you? You could have redirected me, sent me to the kitchen, made an excuse. The room would have accepted it. They were practically waiting for it." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The last candle between them guttered and caught again. "Because the room was watching to see what I would do," he said, "and I decided a long time ago that I would not be the kind of man who performs cruelty for an audience."
She thought about that answer on the car ride home. She was in the back of a black car Silas had called without asking her preference, and she had let him because she was too tired to argue small things. The city moved past the window in streaks of orange and white, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and tried to sort what the evening had actually been. It had been a trap, that was true. It had also been, somehow, the most honest conversation she had been part of in years. That was also true. And the distance between those two truths felt like the distance between the girl on the sidewalk and the woman who had sat at the head of that table without disintegrating. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. "I'd like to see you again, not as a joke, not as a placement, as myself, S." She stared at the message for a long time. She had spent 32 years learning the architecture of her own invisibility, the particular way a woman built like her learned to take up less space, to apologize for her own presence, to preemptively diminish herself so that others wouldn't feel the need to do it for her. It was an exhausting way to live. It was the only way she had known how. And then a man at the head of a table full of people who expected him to confirm her worst fears had extended his hand, palm up, and said, "You're here. That's sufficient." She typed back, "What do you actually want from this?" His reply came in under a minute. "I want to eat honest bread, and I want to talk to someone who tells me the truth without needing anything in return for it. In my experience, that's rarer than anything money can purchase." She looked out the window at the city, at the lights of the Bronx coming into view, familiar and warm in the way that only the place that raised you can be warm. She thought about her mother in the hallway, watching her in the mirror. "You carry yourself like you're apologizing for taking up space. Stop that." She thought about what Silas had said about loneliness, the flatness of his voice when he said it, not self-pity, just fact. The acknowledgement of a man who had built an empire and discovered somewhere in the middle of it that empires are very large and very quiet and very cold. She thought about the lavender dress, the balloon pig, the bay window. She typed back, "There's a bakery on Arthur Avenue. We open at 6. The ciabatta is ready by 7. If you want honest bread, that's where it lives." She pressed send before she could think better of it.
3 days later, at 6:47 in the morning, a black car parked in front of Harmon's bakery. Silas Calloway walked through the door in a charcoal coat and the expression of a man who was somewhere he had decided to be, deliberately and without apology. Mr. Harmon looked up from behind the counter. "Morning," he said. "First time?" "First time," Silas confirmed. "Then you're in for something," Mr. Harmon smiled. "Soleil, you've got a customer." She came out from the back with flour on her forearms and her locks pinned up under a cloth, holding a pan of ciabatta still steaming from the oven. She looked at Silas standing in her bakery, in the warm, yeasty, imperfect air of the place that had been hers long before this week, and she felt something in her chest that she had no immediate name for. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't the resolution of anything. It was something smaller and more durable than that. The feeling of a door that had been closed for a very long time, swinging open just far enough to let the light come through. She set the pan down and handed him a piece of ciabatta, warm, uneven, a crust that fought back. "Well," she said. He took a bite, said nothing for a moment. Then, "This is the most honest thing I've eaten in 20 years." She didn't smile, but something in her face did.
They didn't call it anything at first. Silas kept coming back to the bakery, twice a week, then 3 times. He sat at the small table near the window and drank black coffee and read documents while Soleil worked. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were equally comfortable. Nadine was quietly dropped from the Lux staffing client list without explanation, which was all that would ever be said about it, and Soleil had decided that was enough. What Silas Calloway had seen the night he crossed that room wasn't beauty in the narrow, manufactured sense that the people at his table understood. It wasn't performance or packaging or the kind of presence money could manufacture. It was something rarer, a woman who had been handed every reason to disappear and had chosen, again and again, to remain, to take up space, to tell the truth about bread and grief and loneliness without flinching. He had spent 43 years in rooms full of people who told him what he wanted to hear, and in walked Soleil Beaumont, sent as a joke, standing in the wrong doorway, knuckles white, telling him that his bread was polite and that she didn't trust polite things. The reason he couldn't take his eyes off her wasn't hidden at all in the end. It was the simplest thing in the world. She was real, and in his world, real was the rarest thing there was. If this story moved you, subscribe to Love in the Underworld. Hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. Tell me what moment stayed with you. We'll see you in the next one.